All right, guys, here we go.
All right, here we are. We're continuing with chapter 4 in our Come Let Us Reason text here for logic. Just a quick note in reference to a question that was asked last evening regarding last week's problems. Apparently, there was a question with, I believe it was number 5, and on page 56, your exercises for 3.6. There's a little confusion. Number 5 says, or 5C, the original statement is, some atheists are not immoral, and it says that statement is true. Of course, that's a particular negative statement, A-E-I-O. So the last statement in number 5 is C, all atheists are not immoral. Now, at first glance, that looks like an E-type statement, a universal negative there. But this is a trick of language, as you see that hopefully is still there visible on the discussion board. There was some confusion that some people said, wait a minute, some atheists are not immoral is not the same as saying all atheists are not immoral. Well, yes and no. Remember, the trick of language is this. Usually when someone, you have to be careful. When you see all paired with are not, think about it. That's usually going to mean the same thing as your first statement there. Some atheists are not immoral. Why? Well, the example I gave is, imagine if someone says your friends are a bunch of drunks, and then you, thinking of some friends of yours that are teetotalers, they don't drink at all, and you say, all my friends aren't drunks. All my friends are not drunks. You're not saying a universal negation there. What you're really saying is that some of them aren't drunks. Why? Well, because some are teetotalers. So I have to be careful with that. That's a trick of language. Anytime you see all paired with are not, be ready to assume, not assume, that's too loose a word there, but be ready to take into account that may be saying logically that it may be actually a particular negation there. You may be saying some are not. So anyway, just a word on that before we continue to move on. So having said that, chapter 4 here, we're going to talk about other types of syllogisms, and these are still in our deductive type of syllogisms. Before they move into that here, he's just going to kind of give you a little introduction into it's a symbolic logic. Well, it's not really symbolic logic. That's a whole different area of study than traditional Aristotelian logic. What it really means there is just some of these symbols. So it really means symbolic in the most strict sense possible there. They're just talking about some symbols. So the first example is a categorical syllogism. Instead of saying something like all S is P, no P is X, therefore no S is X, it just gives you the symbols to do that. Basically, it's shorthand. So you see the inverted wedge or the sideways wedge there. It looks like the arrow key, or it looks like a greater or less than sign. So those are symbols just you can use for shorthand. In fact, they do that throughout the rest of this particular chapter in regards to all of these different types of syllogisms. And then, of course, they try to give you an explanation. Or not try to, they do. They give you an explanation as to what those symbols actually mean. And again, that's just to try to give a little familiarity with using those types of symbols. So instead of going through those every time we come to them, you'll see like on that, obviously the side wedge, it just means is or are. And then you'll see a sideways wedge there, a little arrow with a line straight down through it. And that just means the opposite. That just means is or are not. As you come through to your hypothetical syllogisms, you'll see a horseshoe, a sideways horseshoe. That just symbolizes an if-then. The wedge, another wedge that is pointing straight down, or an arrow that points straight down, that just represents your disjunctive syllogism, an either-or type statement. Your little period or your raised dot, that just means and. It just means and. And then your little tittle or your little negation sign there, it just means not. And then your three little dots of a triangle reminds me of, I might date myself a little here, but it reminds me of the little, what's the word I'm looking for here? Basically the way the projected target or bullseye part that the Predator uses in the movie The Predator through his alien shooting device is that looks just like this little 3 pyramid dot here that just symbolizes conclusion or therefore. So those are just some symbols that they introduce you to. You see them pop up through the chapter here as they introduce these different types of syllogisms. So having already talked about that, we'll just continue to move on. Now, your first other type of deductive syllogism is a hypothetical syllogism. Now, this may be, they kind of I don't want to say oversimplify here, Brooks and Geisler, but they only. Sorry about that. They really talk about a modus ponens and a modus tollens type argument in relation to hypothetical syllogisms. You may want to check your Peter Kreeft text there in Socratic Logic, because he really goes into a little more detail about what these hypothetical syllogisms really can contain, what they really may be, as well as only a modus ponens and your modus tollens type of arguments. But anyway, the modus ponens argument, again, hypothetical. Why? Well, because it's an if-then type statement. Your modus ponens is just Latin for way of affirmation. So you're just affirming something here. You're not negating, you're not denying something, you're affirming something here. So if P, then Q. P, therefore Q. So if you had an actual example here, they give an example here. It says, if Jesus Christ rose from the dead, then he is God's son. Jesus rose from the dead, therefore he is God's son. Of course, the point is that if the antecedent, the first half of that is true, if that's true, then it entails the truthfulness of the second half. So, of course, the way to get around that would, you have to somehow argue, if you wanted to deny that type of syllogism, deny that type of argument, you have to somehow show that those aren't necessarily, that the truthfulness of one doesn't necessarily entail the truthfulness of the other. Because, of course, again, valid rules, or formally speaking, if the antecedent is true, then whether you like it or not, the antecedent, the second half of that statement, has to be true as well. Again, if we're concerned about the formal rules, which we are at this point. Now, notice that he affirms the antecedent there. Again, the antecedent being the first half of the statement. This is, again, we're talking about the formal rules. You have to affirm that. You cannot deny the first half of the statement and then anything follow logically from that. That would be the formal fallacy of denying the antecedent. You have to affirm that. If you want to, if you're going to say something like, say again, our example here, if Jesus Christ rose from the dead, then he is God's son. You can either deny the consequent, you can deny the second half of that, or you can affirm the antecedent. You cannot deny the first half and anything logically follow. And you cannot affirm the second half, the consequent, and anything logically follow. If we're talking about the logical rules, which we are at this point, we're talking about the formal rules. The way you make this syllogism work formally, validly, is you have to affirm the first half, or you have to deny the second half. You have to affirm the antecedent, or you have to deny the consequent. If you reverse that, then you've broken the rules of logic there, in the sense that nothing will logically follow. You've committed a formal fallacy. Of course, namely, if you try to deny the antecedent, you've committed the fallacy of what? Denying the antecedent. If you try to affirm the consequent, then you've committed the formal fallacy of affirming the consequent. In hypothetical syllogisms, or in a modus tollens type argument, modus ponens always affirms, way of affirmation, so you have to affirm the antecedent. Modus tollens, in order for that to work logically, you have to deny the consequent. So again, that looks like this. If Jesus Christ rose from the dead, then he is God's son. Affirm the antecedent. Jesus Christ rose from the dead, therefore he is God's son. Of course, if you want to get around that, you have to deny the premise, the truthfulness of the very first premise, just like you would have to deny in a normal categorical syllogism. You'd have to if all the rules are followed, the only way to get out of the argument is to show somehow that one of the premises is not true. So we've kind of covered both of those in one sitting there, the modus ponens and your modus tollens arguments there. And again, look at Kress. He kind of goes in a little more depth about your hypothetical syllogisms, not just your modus tollens and your modus ponens arguments. Now, they're going to say the fallacies of the hypothetical syllogism, but we've already discussed those. And it should be fairly easy to see. Again, following the text here, the text is very good in its way of explanation here, that the reason these are fallacies is because, we say that nothing logically follows if you commit one of these formal rules, or if you break one of these formal rules. Well, it's pretty easy to see, again, that the reason being that nothing logically follows is because there may be some other way in which the statement is still true or the statement is still false if one of these rules are broken. And you can kind of see that in these examples that they give you of the fallacies of the hypothetical syllogisms. Now, continuing on here, we look at our disjunctive syllogism. Now, remember, your disjunct is, what are you doing? You're disjuncting. That is, you're disjoining some sort of statement. So hypothetical syllogisms are easy to remember because, again, they're if-then. That just obviously just is a hypothetical situation. If then. So that's easy to remember what those types of syllogisms deal with. And again, remember they're deductive types of syllogisms. All of these are. Now, disjunctive, also easy to remember the kind of syllogism that it is because it's disjoining. So what kind of statement is it going to entail? An either or. Either this or that is disjoining two statements. Or it's a statement that's just disjoining two concepts there. So disjunctive, disjoin, either or. Easy to remember. Now, again, they give you some of the symbols here, but essentially it's just this, either P or Q, not Q, therefore P. Now, again, in order to not break any rule here, logically, formally, any of the formal rules, you can't really affirm something here. You have to deny. You always have to deny either the first half of the disjunct or the second. You have to deny either P or Q. So you can deny Q. You can say either P or Q, not Q, therefore P. Or you can deny it the other way, either P or Q, not P, therefore Q. So it's either one or the other. Now, Kreft, again, is going to he's going to take a slightly different angle, say something a little different. For instance, down here, their example is either God exists or God does not exist. Now, Kreft would say this is a strong disjunct, meaning that even if you affirm one, it just necessarily entails the falsity of the other. Now, Geisler and Brooks say that too here, but they still want to say, just to be on the safe side, you still want to work that in to where you're actually denying something. Kreft is going to say, again, just look at what Kreft says there. He takes a slightly different angle on that and tries to argue that essentially if you affirm one, it just by necessity is going to falsify the other. But again, don't take my word for that. Look at that yourself. See how he words that there. But again, just to be on the safe side, always deny. If you're making a disjunctive syllogism, always deny either the first or the second there. Either deny P or deny Q. And that way, if someone else is going to, even if someone else tries to argue with you, well, no, that's not a strong disjunct, you don't have to worry about that particular objection because you're just going to go ahead and deny anyway. You're not going to take for granted that if you affirm, then it entails the falsity of the other. If you always just make a habit of denying, you're not going to break the formal rule. So long as you do it in the right way, you just deny. Now, your conjunctive syllogism is going to, well, oh, and I should say this too, obviously the fallacy there is if you affirm. So again, the only time it's not a fallacy is if it falls into what Peter Kreft calls in his text, Socratic logic, a strong disjunct of some sort. So in order to not worry that you're committing the fallacy, because the fallacy is, affirming, in order to not worry that you're committing that, well, maybe this is a strong disjunct, maybe I can get away with affirming here, just get into the habit of denying. That way you're not going to go wrong there. So again, the fallacy there, the formal fallacy is to affirm something in a disjunctive syllogism. Yeah, unless it's a strong disjunct. But again, so you don't have to worry about that. You just get in the habit of denying. Now, a conjunctive syllogism is going to be something on the other side of the spectrum as opposed to a disjunctive syllogism. You're conjoining. You're bringing together there. So again, if disjunctive syllogisms are either or, well, then obviously your conjunctive are going to be your both and type of propositions. Now, these are going to talk about the trick here is to remember that when you're trying to join two statements together, that they both have to be true together. So for instance, if part of that statement is false, then the whole thing altogether is false. So for instance, again, in everyday language, you realize this. So if I were to say something like, both Dan and Bridget have on a red shirt. Well, let's say that only one of them has on a red shirt. Let's say, Bridget has on a blue shirt. But I had said both Dan and Bridget have on a red shirt. Well, obviously, if Bridget has on a blue shirt, then it's not true that both Dan and Bridget have on a red shirt. Even though Dan has on a red shirt, the statement as a whole has to be false. Because remember, my claim was not just that Dan had on a red shirt. My claim was that both of them, my claim was that both Dan and Bridget had on a red shirt. So even if just one of them doesn't, they stand together or they fall together. So even though it's true that one does have on a red shirt, if they both don't, then the statement as a whole is false because my claim was not just concerning one, my claim was concerning both. So again, remember, conjuncts must be denied as a whole. If one part of the statement is false, just as they say here, then the conjunct is false as a whole. If it is not possible to negate one of the conjuncts, then there is no basis for denying the conjunct as a whole. So just look over that. Again, not too difficult. They word that nicely. It's explained pretty clearly there. Now, looking at our dilemmas, these are going to be a combination of a dilemma is, and again, this is one of those things that it can become so technical because we're looking at it in a logic textbook, literally. that you forget, again, that you use these all the time. If you can kind of step back and look at this from the big picture, not, as they say, can't see the forest for the sake of the trees kind of thing. If you step back, you realize this isn't such a difficult concept here because we use these all the time. No different in regards to a dilemma, which is a form of syllogism. It sounds complicated. Why? Well, because a dilemma is a combination of syllogisms. It's a combination of if-then type arguments, hypothetical type syllogisms, with a disjunctive type syllogism, either or. But again, if we step back, look at this in a big picture, it's not that difficult. We do these all the time. For instance, you've done this. You want to go to some particular restaurant. Your wife wants to go to another restaurant, or your friend or whoever. Well, in trying to make your case, you say, well, if we go to this restaurant, blah, 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 then this results. And if we go to your restaurant, then this results. So either this, blah, 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 or blah, blah, blah. And so you try to paint a picture that no matter which choice, some particular effect or some particular consequence is going to come about. Now, usually a dilemma is you're going to try to make them both negative. It's going to be the consequence, that is. It's going to be some sort of negative consequence. Look, if you do this, then this results. If you do that, then that results. So either you do this and something happens you don't want, or you do that and something happens you don't want. Of course, they can be positive as well when you're trying to, say, make a case again for your restaurant. If this happens, blah, 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 which is the consequence is a good thing. Or on the other hand, if this happens, then blah, 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 the consequence is a good thing. So if we do this is a good that will result. If we do that, then this is a good that will result. So either way, some sort of good thing is going to result here. Again, this is so easy to overthink because we're looking at it in the logic text. But again, this is stuff we use every day. Now, the fallacies, the way you can mess up or screw up a dilemma is the same. The same rules apply. The same way you would mess up a disjunctive syllogism by affirming instead of denying. Same rule. Why? Well, because you're using a disjunctive syllogism in your dilemma. Hypothetical syllogism. Same way you would mess up a hypothetical syllogism, formally speaking, with formal rules of logic. If you affirm the consequent and or deny the antecedent, that's going to mess up a dilemma. Why? Well, because the rules, again, are all the same, because you're just using an either-or argument, a disjunctive syllogism, combined with an if-then type argument, a hypothetical type syllogism. So if you mess up the formal rules for one of those, well, then it just messes up the formal rules for the dilemma, because a dilemma just is those two types of arguments combined. Now, how do you get around a dilemma? The way you get around a dilemma is just you just show that it's there's the names are actually called. You either take the dilemma by the horns, because a dilemma, if you look at it, you can picture kind of a bull, on a wall, a steer, maybe the steakhouse, and they've got the huge steer on the wall, his mounted head. He's got these two huge horns on top of his head. So the dilemma tries to put you on the horns of two choices, hence the horns of a dilemma. So the first way you can get out is to take one of the horns, take the horns of the dilemma. You take one of those horns and you show that his first option is not really what he's saying will happen. So you say, well, you say if this, then that, but that's just not the case. So if you can show that to be false, then you've taken the dilemma by the horns and you've shown it really won't work. And again, you can do that to either horn if possible. Now, a good dilemma is going to not allow that. So the only way you can overcome that type, if they're really true, and if this, then that type statements on either side of the horns, well, then you can do what's called split the horns of dilemma. That means you go right through the middle. Why? Well, because a lot of times people frame dilemmas, like the guys our text here gives a good example of the Euthyphro dilemma about God, choosing the good, and all those sorts of things. A good dilemma will actually exhaust all logical possibilities, meaning that it really, truly is either this or that. As they show here, if their dilemma doesn't really, logically speaking, exhaust all of the possibilities, well, then you can just show that there's another possibility. You can just show that there's something else that's just logically possible. It doesn't even have to be true, or that is, you don't even have to know if it's true. You can just show that it's logically possible, like they do here. Well, it's logically possible that God commands in accord with his nature, which is the standard. That's a logical possibility. Was it true? That doesn't even have to necessarily be your concern if you're just trying to get around the dilemma. You're just trying to show that it's logically possible. That is, you split the horns of a dilemma. You show that there's actually a third way. It's not really either this or that. There's this possibility over here. So that's one of the better ways to refute or go against a dilemma there, get out of that dilemma. Now, they give another example where you can basically just offer a rebuttal. You can counter a dilemma. You can offer a dilemma on your own. You can just read over that, because that really doesn't prove anything either way. It just gives a different perspective, and you can check that out. Now, Soul writes on page 73. This is basically just, and I like how they talk about how the Greek word here just means a heap, because that's really what this kind of argument is it just heaps up a bunch of statements, a bunch of premises together to carry you to a certain conclusion. So their example here is perfect. In fact, I love how they use this, which example they use. All who suffer persevere, all who persevere develop character. And it goes on to make the conclusion, therefore, all who suffer can rejoice. Now, what do you notice? You notice that the conclusion, excuse me, I have a terrible cold if you can't tell already. What you can tell is that the conclusion has a term from the very first premise. What was the very first premise? All who suffer rejoice. Has a term from the very first premise, and it has a term from the very last premise. It connects the very first term in the premise, in the very first premise, with the last term in the last premise. See how that works? Now, the key here is, if you'll read the rule here, the trick is to link them all together so that the predicate of the preceding premise is always the subject of the following. That's the way that you can actually make this logically valid, and you can connect them to get to the conclusion that you want, logically speaking. Now, again, how do you get out of this type of argument? If, say you're on the other end and you're trying to get out of this argument, well, if they follow the rules, you can't get out of the argument by just saying you don't like it, obviously. There's no formal fallacy. That is to say, they've connected they've linked them all together, that the predicate of the preceding premise is always the subject of the following one. If they've actually done that, what are you going to do? Just like any other deductive syllogism, you've got to go show where one of the premises is false. You can't do it. You can't say they've broken a logical rule. If the logic is right, you've got to debate or show that one of the premises is not true. Now, the last is the most popular. It's really not a compound syllogism at all. It's not. Nothing is lumped together. In fact, as they point out, this is really the opposite of that. They're leaving out a premise. But this is almost always how you'll hear people argue on television or newspaper ads or magazines or Facebook or whatever, some sort of social media outlet. People, whether they know it or not, and this is why, again, it's silly and ridiculous to argue against logic, because when people use these types of arguments here, this last example, they're banking on the logical nature of the human mind to do its job. So as they say, I'll just quote it. It says just this type of argument at the bottom of page 74 relies on the logical nature of the human mind to do its job and fill in the missing information. That is to say, fill in the missing premise. You're just going to do that. Your mind is geared to do things this way. I love how they worded it. They just worded it so perfectly and succinctly there, because that really is what's taking place. And their example, you should buy our cereal because we have 20% more oat bran. Well, they're just banking on the fact that your mind has constructed its own syllogism as to why that's a good thing. They don't have to say because it's good not to have heart attacks, because if you don't have a heart attack, then you live longer, and living longer is good, and so on and so forth. In fact, my little girl, one of my children, used this type of argument with me just recently. She said in school they were going through some sort of health class or whatnot, and they were talking about the dangers of cigarettes. And so she essentially just said we shouldn't smoke because cigarettes are bad for our health. Well, she was banking on the fact that my mind would construct a syllogism filling in those left out premises, namely that, well, to be unhealthy is bad because, you don't live as long, you don't have some sort of quality of life issue, so on and so forth. She didn't have to fill in those types of missing premises. And she's only 6 or 7 years old. And so she knows, again, because her mind is made to work that way, that she can say a couple premises and know that my mind will also fill in those missing blanks there, fill in those premises. And again, these are the kind you'll see most often on Facebook, whatever the case would be, news, media, whatever. Now, the trick about these is sometimes because they rely on you to rely on your mind to do what it's made to do and fill in missing premises, sometimes it's actually hard to pick up on what somebody's trying to argue, especially if they're assuming that you're on the same page with them about some particular issue. Now, this works to a great deal because most times we are on the same page with someone that we're conversing with. But sometimes we're not. And so that's sometimes what makes it difficult. Wait a minute, what are you actually arguing here? What are you saying? I'm kind of lost here. Of course, you can say those types of things if you're with them face to face. It may make it a little more difficult, however, if you're just reading a post or an email or whatnot. You may have to actually investigate to see what are they actually claiming here. What sort of logical connection are they trying to make with their claim here? And again, Kreeft does a really good job in addressing this particular argument as well, because one, he points out that you want to give them the benefit of the doubt. Well, maybe they're saying this. Maybe this is what they're saying. You don't want to read them uncharitably. So just, if you can, Again, check out Kref's words here. It's there in the recommended reading. Because when I have this recommended reading between the Kref text and the Geisler text here, they're going to be roughly the same types, roughly the same sections dealing with the same material. So they're going to offer their own insights there, offer their own angles that can help you form a full, a more robust type view of each of these particular points, each of these arguments, each of these concepts here. So Kref adds some interesting stuff here on this type of argument. The last example that is definitely worth checking out. Now, going through these examples here, at the end, your exercises, I should say. Again, you shouldn't have too much of a problem with these. As has already been pointed out, there have been, you're going to run into a couple typos every now and then. I can't remember if there are any in this particular section or not. So if you do, again, just wrestle with those. They're not. I don't want to make it sound as if there's typos or just mistaken at the end of all the exercises. They're not by any stretch of the word. But don't be surprised if every once in a while you might run into one. Anyway, I think that you'll do a good job on these exercises. We're starting to get more the enjoyable, I would say, at least, that may be a bit subjective, but more the enjoyable aspects of the text. We've kind of bypassed, or we've gone through already, not bypassed. We've already gone through some more technical, almost math type related aspects of logic here. We're going into some different areas. Of course, they all tie together, but in my view, a little more fun, so to speak. So enjoy those exercises and see you next week.